Zeroville is a real-life movie that came out, that I watched, that was directed by James Franco. If you haven't heard of this movie, that is completely unsurprising. Not only is this one of the worst films of the year that no one is talking about, but also no one saw it. At the time of making this video, Zeroville has made less than $70,000. Dead serious. A movie starring James Franco, Megan Fox, Will Ferrell, and Seth Rogen couldn't even make $100,000, which is probably the amount they spent every day on set to have said actors. Crazy how the mighty have fallen.
Cut.
To be fair though, I'm not sure I've even seen a trailer for this movie. The trailer on YouTube barely has more views than the movie made money, which is problem number one with how this movie performed. You can't expect people to see a movie if they don't know it exists. There's not even interviews for the film except for this singular one where James Franco rambles on about why he cast the actors that he did.
Joey King, I worked with on The Wizard of Oz. She actually played this animated creature.
I realized that they probably gave 99% of the film's budget to the cast, but you gotta find some extra cash somewhere to actually advertise the film. Slapping a trailer on YouTube can only drum up so much attention when that trailer isn't also being put elsewhere. Now, I promise I'll talk about this dumpster fire of a film soon, but the release of this movie fascinates me too much to not talk about it. So, issue number 2 with its release is its opening weekend. Not only do people not know about this film thanks to the non-existent marketing, but it only opened in 80 theaters. How do you expect anyone to come to a smug art house movie made by the Hollywood elite that they don't know about if it only plays in 80 theaters? This has to be one of the most clueless releases this year, which is why the film only made $9 grand opening weekend. If you know anything about releasing a film to theaters in today's market, then you'll know that most of the films released make the majority of their money opening weekend and then are met with 60% drop-offs by week 2. In order to make any money from a theatrical run, you need a lot of things to go right, and this film didn't even feel like it tried. It had basically no advertising, there was no interest in it, it was released in barely any theaters, there was no material made to market it, and then the word of mouth was exceptionally poor. The few people that ended up actually seeing this hated it, and that doesn't bode well for word of mouth. There's a ton of movies throughout time that don't find an audience right away, but through the power of video on demand and word of mouth, they can come away with a large audience and actually make money. The problem here is that people hated this movie and the DVD just sort of came out. Again, with no advertising. No one knew about this movie when it hit theaters, and they sure don't know about it now that it's on DVD. I'm convinced that you could throw this trailer around for a week, show all of these stars, and vaguely hint at what the film is about, and people would have shown up. You have so many angles to market this film from, but somewhere, somebody said, who cares? And now the film is in the red, and the studio that released it probably lost tens of millions of dollars on this embarrassing art house nonsense made by notorious Hollywood hack James Franco.
You failed!
Which brings us finally to the film itself. This movie is quite possibly the worst thing James Franco has ever done. It doesn't make any sense at all, it's incredibly cheap looking, and it's mind-bogglingly obtuse. I'm sure James Franco feels very good about himself for making this weird thing, but it's completely incompetent and incoherent. For one, the filmmaking is straight up amateur. If this film didn't have money behind it, I don't doubt for a second that it would be on the level of Trolls 2. It's seriously that inept at just basic filmmaking.
Oh my God!
But before we get too much in depth about the editing or the other problems that this film has, let's try to unpack this movie and what it's about. Not only does James Franco direct this, but like any good vanity project, he also stars in it, as our main character, Vicar, a man who decides to head to Hollywood to work on movies. He loves movies so much that he gets a tattoo of Place in the Sun stars Montgomery Clift and Elizabeth Taylor on the back of his head, showing that he boldly and unapologetically lives for movies. He He gets extraordinarily lucky by getting a job in set design despite having no experience. Then he gets even luckier by meeting and becoming friends with a prominent film writer, based on John Milius, and an editor. From here, the film turns from him trying to make it in Hollywood into a romance between him and Megan Fox, Soledad, who sometimes haunts his nightmares and sometimes disappears for no reason. Soledad also ends up starring in a film he is editing, and it's implied he only took the job editing it because of her. It's an incredibly hard to follow romance that takes turns out of nowhere that completely shift the film, like when Vicar finds out that Soledad's daughter lives in a car, or when she disappears and abandons her child towards the end.
Hey, stop!
Not a lot of it makes sense, and even less of it works, but that's the bare bones rundown of the film. The biggest issue it has, hands down, is the central character, Vicar. He's like a video game character. He says very little and shows even less emotion, unless he does. But he always does the right thing, unless he doesn't. There's a blatant lack of consistency with not only his character, but with all the characters. The movie starts and you see James Franco sleeping on a bench and then getting pulled in by the cops who scream at him, which I guess causes him to freak out. This begins the strange journey into trying to understand this character and the film itself. The first few scenes of a movie typically are used to establish character, location, tone, and pacing. Using that knowledge, I expected a crude, in-your-face, fast-paced comedy because of these early scenes, like most of James Franco's other works with Seth Rogen. Yet, it's not really any of those things. I expected James Franco to be constantly thrust into wacky situations and for him to handle it not very well. But that doesn't really happen either. After losing his mind in this scene, he only ever shows emotion this much again when he bashes Craig Robinson over the head or when his movie is pulled out from under him.
You killed the movie!
Vicar, what are you doing here?
You killed my movie!
How dare you!
His character isn't a manic, crazy person like he's portrayed here. He's a quiet, lovable idiot. Or at least that's what it seems like he's supposed to be. He kind of reminded me of Travis Bickle from Taxi Driver, which I believe is intentional. Travis Bickle isn't relatable or likable either, but at least the film was all about him and his struggles, so at least you could understand him. At times, Zeroville feels completely disinterested in Vicar. If this character was a catalyst to view Hollywood in the 70s through, then it would be fine to not develop him very much. But you'd still need to know his motivations, his wants and needs. Vicar sometimes wants to be a great filmmaker who makes art, and other times he couldn't care less about movies, instead opting to chase some girl he barely knows. Not only is the character writing kind of inconsistent, but James Franco is absolutely the wrong person to be in this role. There's something about the way he carries himself and acts that screams gross arrogance. Even in roles like this, where he's supposed to come across lovable, he just comes across smug.
That's not my name.
And that's the biggest issue with this character. In every scene, regardless of context, James Franco just looks like he knows something the other characters don't and is quietly holding it over their head. Even the basic construction of a scene is all but thrown out the window at many points here. Take this scene with Craig Robinson, for example. Franco is watching a movie when suddenly Robinson breaks in to try and rob him, I assume. Franco bashes him in the head, knocking him out. Then these two have a moment discussing the film Franco is watching, despite Robinson being tied up. Near the end of the scene, Franco unties him and goes to bed, while Robinson stays and finishes the movie. End scene. But why? This scene has the outline of a regular scene. It has a setup, James Franco watching TV at home. It has a conflict, Craig Robinson breaking in, and it has a resolution, Franco and Robinson sort of becoming friends and Franco letting him go. On the surface, it's about what you'd expect out of a scene, not taking the context of the rest of the film into account. Problem is, There is a film here to be accounted for. If a scene doesn't affect something later on, then it's effectively useless and should be pulled out. Every scene should be vital for the overall film, whether it's to develop a character, set up something for later, or to push the story forward. A well-constructed scene can do all three at once, even though you don't necessarily need to do everything in any given scene. Here though, the only thing we learned that we don't already know is that this character who broke into Franco's house has never been seen before. So if you were like me, you assume that he would become more involved in the story going forward. But that's not the case. He only comes back in one scene after this. The two scenes he is in are so strange and pointless, I'm not sure why they're here. What would cutting them change? If they were cut, then we wouldn't have been subjected to this terrible looking set, and we wouldn't know that Craig Robinson knows a lot about movies. That's it.
Every scene should have an emotional turn, or it'll suffer from some of the following weaknesses. The characters are simply having a conversation without any direction. If the characters are not trying to get something in the scene, conversation is the writer failing to dramatize the subject they want to explore.
You could argue that we learn that Vicar is more trusting of people that know about movies because of this scene, but we already know that. He goes to a house party with a guy he barely knows because he's a writer on movies. It's not as if this writer promises that he'll meet people that could propel his career. He goes there with him because he knows movies. So what purpose does Robinson's character actually serve? It's not as if this character is important to the story either. He doesn't come back to save James Franco from certain death, nor does he get involved in anyone else's lives. He tries to rob Franco twice, and that's it. So the scene doesn't work on a character front, and it barely functions in a setup payoff way, which means it has to push the story forward in some way. But it doesn't. A few scenes earlier, Franco was on the street with barely enough money for a hotel, and now he has a house, which allows the audience to infer he got money from his job to get a house at some point and we didn't see it. That's fine. But this house is never seen or heard from again. The rest of the film is either set in hotel rooms, other people's mansions, or editing rooms. So why even establish the house?
This is all wrong.
The fact that we only see it here makes me wonder if this scene was shot later just so Craig Robinson, a friend of James Franco, could be in a movie that is directed by James Franco. Other than that, there is no reason for this scene to exist. It looks cheap, does nothing for the story, sets up a boring payoff, and reiterates information about the main character we have already learned a few scenes ago.
Here's a list of essential dynamics I use to make sure a scene is working. Exiting emotional state. What is the character feeling when they exit a scene, and how does it contrast with the emotional state when they enter?
I'm tired.
Oh, go to sleep, man.
The film is full of scenes like this one that simply do not matter, especially in the first half. For a film about a Hollywood editor, the editing here is terrible.
Hi. Are you an actress?
Yes.
This is sickening!
But that brings us back to editing. And the editing in this movie is downright atrocious.
Will you teach me how to edit?
Sure. That's what I'm doing.
Hey fellas, this is what we got going on over here. I'll be there in a second.
The movie relentlessly moves between one scene to the next without giving anything room to breathe. Vicar goes from living on the streets to hanging out with Steven Spielberg in like 10 minutes. There's no sense of structure or pacing at all. Sometimes it moves at 100 miles an hour, and other times it's like watching grass grow.
I hear you've been vexing them over in set design.
There's also a running joke about the movie not caring about continuity, and in the scene where it first states that, there's a pretty good editing joke to riff on this.
Continuity.
Yeah. Continuity. Will you teach me how to edit?
But in this same scene, without any indication of a time change, Vicar goes from an amateur learning how to edit into a professional editor with his name on the door below the editor that taught him how to do that 5 seconds ago. There's no clothing change, no lighting change, no nothing. The only thing that makes sense to explain why this happened is that the film jumped forward like a year and decided not to tell the audience about it. If you wanted to make this time jump feel more earned, you could cut away to an establishing shot showing a weather change, have the characters change clothes, or just have the characters' hair look longer. Instead, they just cut the scene as if no time has passed at all. This just so happens to be the only thing in the movie that is consistent. That being these bizarre time jumps that the film never tells the audience about. At the start of the film, we learn that it's set in 1969, and he's sleeping on the street. He then gets just enough money from building sets to buy one night in a hotel. Then, in the next scene, without warning, he has a house that Craig Robinson breaks into. So we clearly have some kind of unclear time jump from him being on the streets to owning a home in LA, even though it's edited in such a way to make it feel like there hasn't been a time jump. But to give the movie some credit, having him going from the streets to having a house leaves just enough to let the audience think that there has been a time jump. So this sort of works. But then it gets so much more confusing, because after he learns how to edit, he gets called to the set of Apocalypse Now, which was released in 1979, a decade after we were first introduced to this character. So as I was watching it, I safely assumed that a decade had passed. But Megan Fox's character, Soledad, who is based off Soledad Miranda, is a real-life person that died in 1970. So either the film has no clue when in time things have happened, this is all stuff in the book, or all of these things being in the movie are only there because James Franco likes them and wanted to shove them in. Now, again, I haven't read the book, so maybe it is like this in there. But if that's the case, it's still terribly confusing.
Yeah, droids, okay. They're droids? They're not robots? Yeah, they're droids? Oh, I'm sorry.
Even more confusing, though, is when George Lucas shows up to talk about Star Wars, a film released in 1977. And in the same scene, Spielberg is talking about Jaws, that came out in 75. So I have absolutely no idea when in time this film takes place, or when in time it ends. I felt like I was on drugs the first time I watched this. I was desperately trying to figure out what time period it was set in, or what on earth was happening at all. But that's not to say that this type of time distortion is inherently bad. There's plenty of examples of films that mess with the time period they're set in without telling the audience outright. The biggest example I can think of is in the film Synecdoche, New York. This is a film all about death and how quickly time can move past us without us really even noticing. There's a scene early on where the main character is going through his daily routine, and every time he goes to get something, like a jug of milk, time jumps forward. He goes to the fridge after we hear it's one day, but then he says the milk is expired even though the expiration date is set after the date we already heard. Doing this subtly hints to the audience that his routine is the same every day and he is barely noticing time fly by him while he does exactly nothing. It's a subtle and hugely effective way to display the themes of the film without explicitly saying it. Plus, it doesn't seemingly jump forward a decade and then jump backward like this film does. It's actually consistent and makes sense, which is why it works.
I cut together the battle sequence that you guys shot yesterday.
Let's see it.
But niggas kept trying me because I guess I look tryable, niggas, so we gonna see who ready to go to hell.
But before you start typing your comment about how this is a theme of the film, let's talk about said theme. There's a few mentions here and there about how some of the characters feel like movies exist simultaneously before and after they are made, as if they have always and will always exist. Which would explain why, even though it's set in 1969, we go to the set of Apocalypse Now, a film released a decade later. This, however, doesn't explain why a scene can be edited so poorly that years pass without any indication of those years passing. All I have to go on to deduce when in time it's set is by looking up the release dates of the films shown in this, or by looking at Soledad's daughter, who is pretty young here right before James Franco goes to the set of Apocalypse Now, and is like 15 years older here not long after that. So even looking at Soledad's daughter is confusing as to how long it's been since X or Y time.
The secret movie? The one that's hidden frame by frame in all the other movies? Perhaps someone is showing you a way out.
But the strangest thing of all is the plotline that comes out of nowhere near the end of the film, where James Franco keeps finding frames of Megan Fox spread throughout random classic films after she dies. There's little to no setup for this idea. The only things we get are these weird nightmare sequences where James Franco dreams about Megan Fox being burned alive in The Passion of Joan of Arc, which I for one thought were just nightmares that his subconscious was putting the girl of his dreams into movies that he liked. But nope, I guess not. She's just actually in the movie. Instead of having a pointless scene with Craig Robinson watching a movie with Franco, maybe you could have Vicar notice Megan Fox in this movie, but not believe that it was actually her. All you have to do to make it work is to pepper in scenes like this throughout the film. But again, the only thing that hints at this idea is Megan Fox being in Franco's dreams. The first time he notices her in the movies is in this Eraserhead scene. So why not have a couple scenes like this earlier on in the movie to set this up, instead of it coming out of nowhere? There's this incredibly obvious scene near the end of the film where Vicar is found dead, and then him and Megan Fox end up being in the scene that he has tattooed on the back of his head. I knew it was coming, but I didn't think they would awkwardly composite them in the forefront of the image. I guess the point is that he got the Hollywood ending he wanted with the girl of his dreams, who also ditched him for Will Ferrell. It just makes no sense, and seemingly has no greater point. It comes out of nowhere at the last minute and utterly falls on its face. Are they trying to say that movies are his heaven? At first I thought it was trying to say that he was finally with the only two things he loved, movies and Megan Fox, but if that's what it's trying to say, that doesn't fully work, nor is it satisfying. Megan Fox is taking advantage of Vicar through the entire film, and even cheats on him with Will Ferrell. Why does he love her? We also don't really see him being passionate about filmmaking enough to justify this ending. In fact, after he starts dating Megan Fox, he barely does any work on movies. He just keeps replaying the same scene over and over again because it's the only scene they cared to shoot for their fake movie within a movie. I simply don't understand what it's trying to say. All these issues pale in comparison, though, to how cheap everything looks. It's unforgivable for a movie set in Hollywood, starring Hollywood all-stars with big money behind it, to look this bad. All the sets look terrible, this house set being the absolute worst of them all. It's like two walls, with a TV plopped in the middle of the room and a couple chairs. Then there's shots that don't even match from their shot reverse shots. This scene early on between Megan Fox and James Franco being the worst. How is it edited this poorly? You'd think that James Franco is a man in Hollywood who would be able to have enough clout to get the best of the best. But it looks like he just pulled people from under bridges to put this horrible movie together. It's unfortunate that this movie just can't seem to figure itself out, because if it was directed better, if it was edited better, if it was acted better, if it was shot better, if it was written better, then it could have actually been a pretty nice love letter to classic cinema. And from what I understand, the book is exactly that. There is a lot in this movie that pays homage to classic movies, and it is nice to see that. But because the film buries it in so much nonsense, I can't get that out of it here either. But here's the biggest plot twist of 2020. I'd recommend it. It's so dumb and incompetent that it's kind of a blast to watch and yell at and try and figure out. I think in a way, it's the Room of bigger budget movies, which is ironic considering James Franco being involved in both. It doesn't make any sense. It stars the director in the leading role, it's completely incompetent, and tries way too hard to be something it clearly isn't. It's a fascinating watch though, especially if you know the do's and don'ts of storytelling, because the film breaks all of those rules in the most unsatisfactory way possible.